Today on the podcast, we continue our story of legendary Disney designer Herb Ryman. In our last episode, we looked at the final time that Walt Disney visited WED. Ryman had stayed in his office, unable to face Walt, now that, at least to Ryman, it was clear that Walt was dying. And today we pick up the story from that point. If you found Ryman's reaction to Walt's final visit surprising, there's another surprise at the end of today's installment as well, about Ryman's first visit to Walt Disney World. I'm guessing it wasn't arranged in the manner that most fans would expect. It also signaled another significant change in Ryman's life. If you're listening to this episode the week that it's released, we are now 2 weeks away from Christmas. I realize that many people listen to these episodes months and even years after they are first posted. Some wait until a series is finished so that they can binge through them on a long drive or each day over a few weeks on their way to work. But if you're listening to this during December, I want to take this opportunity to wish you the best for this holiday season. Later this week, I'll put up another seasonal podcast that tells the story behind popular holiday traditions at the parks. But right now, let's jump back into the world of Walt Disney and Herb Ryman. It's late November 1966. It was an unusually dry month in California with little to no rain. The daily temperatures, then in the mid-60s, were starting to go down. And inside the studio, the Disney company was moving toward one of its darkest periods, with Walt diagnosed with cancer. And so, if you're ready to move into our story today, let's go. Over Thanksgiving week, Walt left the hospital. He visited his family. He traveled to his second home in Palm Springs. But by the end of the week, he was in pain, weak from both the surgery and the cancer. On Sunday, November 27th, he returned to St. Joseph's. At this point, he still believed he would recover from his illness, allowing his life and work to continue, at least for a while. In his movies, beloved characters often came back from death or near death. Snow White, Pinocchio, Tinkerbell, and even Baloo from the Jungle Book, the animated feature then in production. His art had convinced him that individuals could overcome enormous physical conditions. While in bed, he discussed the future of the studio with family members and a few key executives. At first, Walt described himself leading his artists toward new films, new projects. He told his son-in-law, Ron Miller, "I'm going to stick with Disney World and Epcot. I'll read the scripts. I'll just tell you guys whether to go or not. I just can't become as active as I used to be." Despite his weakness and pain, Walt remained cheerful, even optimistic. He had his 65th birthday in the hospital. Family members visited daily, but Walt continued to grow weak. One evening when Ron Miller visited, Walt said, "Turn on the television." He looked at it for a while. Then, with gravel moving through his words, he said, "Turn the goddamn thing off." After 2 weeks, growing more tired each day, even Walt understood that his life was ending, a condition that he didn't know how to accept. One of his nurses would later say about his final hours, "The poor man was so fearful." In the end, Ryman had seen the situation with clarity. Walt had been close to death the previous month when he visited the WED facility in Glendale. Though he improved briefly, long enough to share Thanksgiving with his family, his health mostly deteriorated in the weeks that followed. On December 15th, Walt died in a hospital room directly across the street from his studio. He was cremated and, after a lengthy family discussion, eventually interred at Forest Lawn Cemetery, also within view of his studio. For his part, Ryman rarely talked about the last time Walt came to WED, the day he remained in his office. When asked about Walt's death, Ryman tended to sidestep the issue, explaining that Walt was a good friend for whom he had tremendous respect. But that final visit stayed with him, another deep area of his life without closure. In the weeks after Walt's passing, the Disney company sunk into paralysis with no one sure how to move forward, particularly on the Florida project. Walt still appeared on TV, with introductory segments for his weekly show filmed months earlier, but his office was now empty. Many turned to Roy, 8 years older than his brother, for leadership, but Roy didn't want to take the role of president as he was presently in the process of retiring. At first, Roy tried to convince the president of Bank of America and longtime Disney board member Clark Bees to take the reins of the company. Roy and his wife Edna drove to San Francisco to discuss the matter with him in person, but Bees turned him down. He too was looking forward to retirement. Without a leader, movement on the Florida project, aside from some early survey work, came to a halt as Roy and Disney board members searched for a new leader, a search that would continue for months. In July, the Carousel of Progress and the People Mover opened at Disneyland, followed a month later by the attraction Ryman had helped design, Adventure Through Inner Space. These attractions were joined by familiar adventures, such as the Circle Vision film America the Beautiful and an updated theater-based simulator, Flight to the Moon. In the months before and after Walt's death, the front half of Tomorrowland had been gutted and rebuilt. In this, Wed replaced the industrial tones that had defined this stretch of Tomorrowland for years with a set of attractions that radiated mid-century design and playful space-age architecture, with rides focused on a modern world on the move. The land was in ways a tribute to Walt's optimism about the future. Overhead, on elevated tracks, was the People Mover, an electric transportation system Walt believed could replace or partially replace the family car for short trips. Not far away was the monorail, another electric system which Walt believed could be used for longer trips. The Carousel of Progress promised that new time-saving appliances would soon transform the life of the American family. In the show space above the Carousel Theater was a newly developed model of an ideal urban metropolis. It was called Progress City, which incorporated many ideas from Epcot. At its center, a high-rise hotel capped with a spire, a green belt separating the downtown from the residential areas, and innovative transportation systems such as the People Mover and the monorail stitching the town together. It wasn't quite Epcot, at least not as envisioned by Walt, but it was close. For the dedication of New Tomorrowland, instead of Walt at the podium, guests saw a line of corporate presenters from sponsoring companies such as Monsanto and General Electric, led by Disney ambassador Marcia Minor and Mickey Mouse. For a park that had been advertised as one man's vision, guests now watched a committee of business professionals standing in for Walt. Inside the company, the failure of this presentation was clear. A creative, family-centered company like Walt Disney Productions needed a single person, not only to discuss the company's vision, but also to represent the values embraced by the company for years. By this point, Roy saw his limited options with clarity. The two lead internal candidates to take over the company, Don Tatum and Card Walker, were still too young and too inexperienced, in Roy's opinion, to manage the role, especially if Disney moved forward with the Florida project. Without a reliable outside executive willing to take the reins, Roy, at the age of 74, agreed to stay on as president, which, at least in the eyes of investors, provided organizational stability. But Roy's previous exposure to the company was primarily in its business areas: legal, accounting, film distribution, and merchandising. Roy himself had never directed a film, nor had he produced a TV episode. For the public, Roy said, "There's no way to replace Walt Disney." With Roy in charge, the company fractured into a collection of fiefdoms, each focused on their own project with light oversight by Roy. Animators worked to finish The Jungle Book. Producers arranged material for the 1967-1968 season of The Wonderful World of Color. Dick Nunes oversaw park operations in Anaheim. These three areas, film, TV, and Disneyland, worked well together as they had for years. WED, however, remained an outlier. For over a decade, WED had been Walt's private company, a retreat away from the studio and also at times from Roy. Roy respected that, but now as he ventured into WED, he saw it as a foreign world, a set of buildings that, according to WED designers, he had previously visited at most once. Though Roy knew how to chart a path forward with films, TV, and the existing park, he would only move forward on the Florida project if leaders at WED agreed to manage the development of the resort, the park in particular. For all intents and purposes, Joe Fowler explained, Dick Irvine took Walt's place with regard to conceiving and the inception of most of the designs for existing projects. Though Irvine had been trained as an artist, he was now in a position of leadership, overseeing a complete division at Disney without Walt's authority. Roy took Dick Irvine and Joe Fowler aside and asked them their plans. "Are you prepared to stay with us so we can build Walt Disney World?" he said. Only after both of them agreed to stay on and manage the Florida project to its conclusion did Roy indicate the company would move forward with it. Once leadership at WED was on board, Roy insisted Imagineers focus on the most familiar and reliable plans, which meant the new theme park. Hotels, in his vision, would be outsourced to U.S. Steel, with additional leadership provided by John Curry, who Walt had personally hired the previous August. Disney would expand into outdoor recreation, such as fishing, golf, and boating, but that was the only new area Roy wanted to explore during the initial phase. Even though Disneyland now displayed a model of Progress City, plans for that actual city would be delayed until a later phase of the Florida project. WED continued to act with relative autonomy from studio management, with employees focused on expansion areas in Disneyland and plans for Walt Disney World. Roy remained interested in the design of the new theme park, but he mostly managed it from a distance. As art director Bill Martin recalled, Roy stayed out of the designed look of the place. He stood aside. During this period, a new power structure at WED coalesced around Dick Irvine, John Hench, and Irvine's assistant, Marty Sklar, all of whom had closely worked with Walt on various projects. This team, however, though friendly with Ryman, was not a group that was overly sympathetic to Ryman's independence. Not long ago, Ryman had made the point of telling Irvine that he only responded to deadlines given by Walt, not by him. Ryman and Irvine still had a great deal of respect for each other, but a few incidents like this remained like a nearly invisible thorn between them, a minor irritation neither could see but both at times felt. Once WED was focused on Florida, Ryman worked to finalize Walt's old dreams. The new park would be an adaptation of Disneyland's original themed lands, with one exception. The Magic Kingdom would include Liberty Square, a variation of Liberty Street. Liberty Street had been focused on colonial Boston, but Liberty Square would include nods to all of the 13 colonies. This assignment hit all of Ryman's strengths, historical research combined with an inviting layout that would create a movie-like set for guests to explore. At its center would be the Liberty Tree, an icon of the revolution that once stood near Boston Commons, a place where young rebels rallied towards independence. The tree had also been featured in a 1957 Disney film about the start of the revolution, Johnny Tremain. Along with period-specific buildings, the square included one of the two shows originally proposed by Walt, the Hall of Presidents, which presented the experience of President Lincoln and the Civil War. Much research was put into each of the presidents in the Hall of Presidents, Ryman explained. Every iota of information, even the color of clothes they liked and such. The other show, once earmarked for Liberty Street, focused on Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and the Declaration of Independence, was left out of the Florida project and returned to Wedd's files of unbuilt concepts. As Ryman had largely developed plans for Liberty Street with Walt, he now largely managed conceptual designs for its successor, Liberty Square. In paintings, he envisioned the exterior of Liberty Hall, along with the semicircular theater that would be placed behind it. On multiple canvases, he brushed out images of cobblestone walkways that moved through the land, paths sited by shops and restaurants. He worked in pencil, watercolors, acrylic, oils, and even gouache, which was a medium favored by those who created background paintings for animated features. For the Hall of Presidents show, he painted wide panels that would be filmed in 70mm and integrated into the cinematic portions of the presentation. The art director for the film was John DeCure, who 30 years earlier had been one of Ryman's students at Chenard. Outside of Liberty Square, Ryman created concepts for the entrance to Tomorrowland just as he had done in the early 1950s for Disneyland. For the Magic Kingdom, he envisioned a long walkway over water with the entrance to the land being a passage between two waterfalls. Elegant flows that spilled over the tops of tall buildings. He painted visions of Fantasyland, where storybook buildings far larger than those at Disneyland rose beside the carousel. And he played with concepts for the building facade of the Haunted Mansion. In California, the mansion had been built in New Orleans Square, its entrance facade reminiscent of a Southern Gothic mansion. But for Florida, Ryman presented the mansion as a 3-story wooden stone structure with a wide front porch, a line of dark, ominous windows, and a slate roof ornamented with 6 chimneys. It was a mansion very much in the style of those found in Boston's oldest neighborhoods, such as Fisher Hill or Beacon Hill, though this design was dropped in favor of the type of stone structures found in the Hudson Valley. Most importantly, Ryman designed the castle. In Ryman's hands, the castle was an enormous structure with spires reaching far into the sky. At Disneyland, the castle was intimate, a storybook relic too small for actual people to inhabit. In Florida, the castle was large enough to hold a restaurant, an operations center, and many additional rooms. In nearly all of Ryman's paintings, the lands of Anaheim were expanded into far more impressive tableaus, with a sense that the initial concepts overseen by Walt in California were now growing to fruition in Florida. Fred Jerger, a model builder, was confused by Ryman's initial castle designs. "When I saw Herbie working on the painting," Jerger said, "I said, 'Herbie, that's the corniest thing. It looks like a Bank of America calendar.'" But Ryman knew the design perfectly fit the scale of the Florida property, a park that was far grander than the one in California. He also understood that he needed to adapt the Disney conceit to the Florida environment, where sunlight was harsher than it was on the West Coast. "California just doesn't have the sky and clouds Florida has," Ryman explained. His design was bold and glitzy, the presentation of a castle to inspire awe rather than curiosity by those who saw it. "The castle will be twice the height and twice the beauty of the one in California," he said. During the late 1960s, as work continued on the Florida project, Ryman saw the world around him change in small ways, something he could not have predicted. While Walt was alive, the public's interest had been focused on Walt. But after his death, the public became interested in those who had worked closely with him. For Ryman, this meant that civic organizations and private collectors were becoming interested in hosting showings of his personal art, so long as he could be introduced as a Disney artist, and so long as he would talk to them both about his time with Walt and the paintings he had created on his own. One early exhibition was called Ryman at Random, an event that supported the development of another of Walt's final dreams, the California School of the Arts. Ryman at Random was the inaugural exhibition in a series that showcased the personal works of some of the outstanding artists who worked for Walt Disney over a period of 40 years. Not long after, Ryman presented his art at the Brand Library Art Center in Glendale. He spoke to art groups about his paintings all around Southern California, including the Art Association in Anaheim. 2 months after that, he gave a public demonstration of his painting techniques for the California Art Club in Santa Monica. The public, or at least some of them, he now saw were curious about his life, not simply because he was a gifted artist, but also because he had been an artist who worked closely alongside Walt. For years, Ryman had viewed personal art and commercial art as diametric opposites, but now he saw a connection. Because of his commercial art for Disney, the public, or at least some people, were becoming interested in his own work as well. Work on his own canvases became a respite from the never-ending assignments at WED. Without Walt and with Roy keeping himself at a distance, WED was becoming more corporate, less open to the idiosyncrasies of classically trained artists like Ryman. Most everyone at WED understood Ryman's process, his period of reflection, his delays, even trips to a nearby bowling alley to help clear his mind. But he always got his work done. Herbie had a wonderful way of postponement, art director George Davis explained. He's like most people that are creative. You put off actually doing it until you have a deadline. You put it off as long as you can to be able to think about it. But without Walt to defend him, Ryman was now exposed to managers who were far less patient than Walt. At times, Ryman looked for ways to protect himself. One of his favorites was a note Walt had once left for him on a stack of illustrations. It was in Walt's easily identifiable curly-Q half-cursive, scribbled out in red Conti crayon. "Herbie," it said, "good job." A rare bit of praise. He kept it so that those at WED would know I was a good artist, and had once been valued by Walt. But the note did little to keep Ryman at the center of the organization. Under Walt, Herbie had worked without a contract. He had been allowed to come and go as he pleased. He had taken on outside projects, illustrating novels and other work. But now a small group of people held those special privileges and Walt's favoritism against him. Similar situations played out elsewhere in the company, where a few managers let unique, idiosyncratic artists once close to Walt know that the times had changed and that the company now needed to work as a unified organization where everyone was treated the same. Among others who found themselves on the outs were Ward Kimball, who found some of his projects canceled, and Rolly Crump, whose designs for the Haunted Mansion were pushed aside in favor of designs completed by those who were closer to the new power center at WED, namely the designs of Mark Davis and Claude Coates. As the Florida project moved forward, it was Dick Irvine's job to keep WED together. Irvine was the exact same age as Ryman. They had both been born in 1910. They had both gone to art school. They had both designed sets for Fox. But the responsibilities of leadership proved to be a substantial burden for Irvine. The stress keeping him up at night, the task of designing and completing a new park without Walt. About his role, Bill Martin explained, Dick Irvine was certainly the catalyst that brought this whole thing together. Despite small internal conflicts at WED and with construction teams in Florida, Marty Sklar explained that even though Irvine was most comfortable in the role of an artist, he just took charge. That was not an easy time. In a way, I guess you could say it cost him his life because he had a heart attack in Florida during the construction. But heart problems didn't end Irvine's life. They weakened him to the point where he was no longer able to lead. Doctors forbade him from flying between Florida and California. Irvine, who had been spending most of his time in Florida, called other managers to express his regret personally, as years earlier he had promised to finish the project. "I have a problem," he told them. "The doctor says I've got to go home." He told them, "I'm letting you down." But no one felt that way. In the final months of construction, Irvine returned home, where he stayed, hoping his condition would improve. Once home, he never again returned to Florida, not even for the opening. The Disney company decided that they should leave a marker on property to honor him, something that could be enjoyed by guests. They settled on a second paddle wheeler to circle rivers of America, to be named the Richard F. Irvine Riverboat. As it was a new addition, the ship wouldn't be finished for nearly 2 years, but everyone at WED wanted Irvine to see the ship as it would one day move around the river. This job fell to Herbie. Even though Ryman and Irvine had had their differences, especially over how Herbie's work would be managed, they were friends, their professional lives intertwined for 3 decades. "I was commissioned to represent the ship on canvas," Ryman said. "Dick was very ill at the time, and it was a Friday afternoon when I got the call from WED asking if I could finish the painting over the weekend. His condition, I was told, was indeed that serious." As Disney World and the Magic Kingdom were finished, WED needed to shrink down its design team. As with the resort nearly open, the company didn't have enough work to occupy all artists on staff. Though Walt never would have laid off Ryman, Herbie returned from lunch one day to find that he, along with many others, were being released from WED, as there were few projects in the pipeline. Other lead artists were protected by their contracts, a contract that Ryman had refused to sign, an arrangement that gave him freedom, but now allowed him to be easily released. Despite all the times he had acted in his own interest to illustrate a book or insist that he was beyond general management, he was let go for the most mundane of reasons. He was a victim of downsizing, though his attitude of independence may have also played into this decision, especially as the power structure at WED was filled with people who were deeply loyal to the company to the point that they had largely given up their own art. In October 1971, despite designing the castle, Ryman was not on the company list to attend the opening of the new resort. He was no longer a Disney employee. Instead, he purchased his own plane fare. Once in Florida, he purchased a general admission ticket to the park. Inside the gates, around areas he had helped design, he was spotted by old friends, artists who still admired him and his work. They invited him to a WED party where he was seen by John Hench, a lead artist who almost surely agreed to the list of artists who were laid off. "Herbie," Hench said, with a note of surprise, "what are you doing here?" As always, Ryman didn't make a fuss, at least not publicly. He only wanted to be included in the celebration. "I was at the opening of Disneyland in 1955 with Walt," Ryman insisted, "and I want to be at the opening of this one, too." That week, he walked the park past the castle he had helped design and through Liberty Street, which was the area he had most deeply overseen. This area, he knew, was one that Walt would have wanted, something planned for Disneyland but eventually realized in Florida. Ryman never discussed exactly how he felt years after the fact about declining to see Walt when he was dying, but whenever he talked about that day, his voice held notes of deep reflection, a type of private sorrow, as though the experience remained one of the key events he still carried with him. If Ryman still felt loss, regret, or even guilt over that moment, almost surely seen Liberty Street as a finished land eased some of his discomfort. This dream that Walt had explored for years, a dream that was financially outside his reach in California, but now developed with exquisite detail in Florida, lovely piles of brick, stone, and wood arranged into buildings, many of them rising beside the water. A piece of American history, something that deeply interested Walt, was now a reality in Florida. And there, in the center of it all, was the Liberty Tree, a southern oak that had been moved with great care to this location, a nod not only to history, but to a live-action feature that Walt had once produced, a feature first released nearly 15 years ago. I'll be back later this week with a seasonal episode, and then next Sunday we'll take a look at everything that is new at both the California and the Florida resort, from the Adventureland Treehouse to the luminous fireworks show to the appearance of the Hatbox Ghost in a slightly different form in the Florida mansion. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us on Bandcamp is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.